I never imagined that answering my front door on that Tuesday morning would shatter my world into pieces I'm still trying to put back together. Mason stood there, shoulders hunched, eyes red-rimmed, clutching a small velvet box in his trembling hands. Behind him, a taxi waited with the engine running, as if he couldn't wait to escape. "William," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm so sorry. Please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what city you're watching from." The words hit me before I could process what I was seeing. Mason, my daughter Amanda's husband of just 6 months, standing alone on my doorstep when he should have been on his honeymoon in the Bahamas with my beautiful 27-year-old daughter. "Where's Amanda?" The question came out strangled, desperate. Deep down, I already knew the answer would destroy me. Mason's face crumpled. He opened the velvet box with shaking fingers, revealing Amanda's wedding ring, the 3-carat diamond I'd helped him pick out just 8 months earlier when he'd nervously asked for my blessing. The ring caught the morning sunlight, throwing tiny rainbows across his pale face. "She's gone, William. Amanda's gone." The world tilted sideways. I gripped the doorframe to keep from falling. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "There was an accident." Mason's words came out in rushed, broken sentences. "We were at Paradise Cove, you know, that beach she loved from the brochures. The water was so blue, so perfect. She wanted to swim out to the reef to see the tropical fish. I told her to wait for me, but you know how Amanda was when she got excited about something." I did know. Amanda had always been fearless, impulsive, diving headfirst into every adventure life offered. It was one of the things I loved most about her, and apparently it had killed her. "The current was stronger than it looked," Mason continued, his voice getting smaller with each word. "By the time I realized she was in trouble, she was too far out. The lifeguards tried everything. The Coast Guard searched for 3 days. They found her body washed up on the rocks near Devil's Point. My legs gave out. I sank onto the porch steps, the rough wood scraping against my palms as I struggled to breathe. My Amanda, my only child, the light of my life since her mother died when she was 12, was gone. Drowned in paradise while I was here, probably watching the morning news and drinking coffee, completely unaware that my world was ending thousands of miles away. "She made me promise something," Mason said, sitting down beside me on the steps. "Before we left for the trip, she made me swear that if anything ever happened to her, I'd make sure you got lucky." He gestured toward the taxi, where I could now see our family's golden retriever pressed against the window, tail wagging uncertainly. Lucky had been Amanda's dog since college, a gift from me when she'd been struggling with anxiety during her senior year. She'd named him Lucky because she said he brought good fortune into her life. Now he was all I had left of her. "I can't keep him," Mason said, his voice breaking. "Every time I look at him, I see her throwing tennis balls in the backyard, laughing when he'd bring back sticks instead. I just can't." The next few minutes passed in a blur. Mason paid the taxi driver, who helped carry Lucky's bed, toys, and food into my house. The dog seemed confused, whimpering softly as he sniffed around the familiar space, clearly looking for Amanda. When he didn't find her, he settled by the door, as if waiting for her to come home. "The funeral arrangements," I managed to say, though speaking felt like swallowing broken glass. "When do we—" "It was yesterday," Mason interrupted, not meeting my eyes. "In Nassau. The hotel arranged everything. They said it would be easier, you know, with all the international paperwork and the condition of— I thought it would be better if you remembered her the way she was." The words hit like physical blows. My daughter was dead and buried, and I hadn't even known. I'd missed her funeral. I'd never gotten to say goodbye. "I have her things," Mason said quietly, pulling a suitcase from the taxi. "Her jewelry, some clothes, pictures. I thought you'd want them." I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. I watched this young man who'd been my son-in-law for less than a year fumble with luggage and explanations, and all I could think was that Amanda should be here. She should be sunburned and happy, showing me pictures of tropical fish and white sand beaches, complaining about Mason's snoring or laughing about some adventure they'd shared. Instead, she was in a cemetery in the Bahamas, and I was alone with her dog and a suitcase full of memories. "I'm sorry, William," Mason said again as the taxi driver started honking impatiently. "I know this isn't how any of us wanted things to end. Amanda loved you so much. She talked about you every day of our honeymoon right up until—" His voice broke completely. He climbed back into the taxi without another word. I watched the yellow car disappear around the corner, taking with it the last person who'd seen my daughter alive. Lucky whined softly beside me, and I realized we were both orphans now. That afternoon, I called my sister Margaret in Phoenix to tell her about Amanda. Her shocked silence stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. "Oh, William, I'm so sorry. Do you want me to come?" I told her no, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe because having people around would make it real. Maybe because I wasn't ready to accept condolences for a death I still couldn't believe had happened. The house felt enormous and empty that first night. I'd lived alone for years after Amanda moved out for college and then her own apartment. But this was different. Before, she was just temporarily absent, always a phone call away, always planning her next visit. Now the silence had weight to it, pressing down on everything like a heavy blanket. Lucky followed me from room to room, his nails clicking on the hardwood floors. When I sat down, he sat beside me. When I stood up, he stood too. Neither of us seemed to know what to do with ourselves. Around midnight, I opened Amanda's suitcase. Her clothes still smelled like the coconut sunscreen she'd always used, mixed with that vanilla perfume she'd worn since high school. I found her camera, a digital SLR she'd saved for months to buy. The last pictures showed her and Mason on what must have been their final morning together. Amanda grinning in a bright yellow bikini, Mason laughing as she tried to balance on a paddleboard, both of them looking impossibly young and happy. The last photo was a selfie of them on the beach at sunset, Amanda's arms around Mason's neck, both of them smiling at the camera. She looked radiant, alive, full of joy and possibility. It had been taken less than 24 hours before she died. I closed the camera and put it away. Some images are too painful to bear even when they're all you have left. That night, I lay in bed listening to Lucky's breathing from his spot on the floor beside me. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had changed. Cars passed on the street. The neighbors' automatic sprinklers came on at 2 a.m. like they had every night for years. The old house settled with its familiar creaks and sighs. But everything was different now. My daughter was dead, and somehow I had to figure out how to keep living without her. The first month after Amanda's death passed like walking through thick fog. I went through the motions of living, feeding Lucky, making coffee, checking the mail, but nothing felt real. I kept Amanda's bedroom exactly as she'd left it when she moved out 3 years earlier. Her favorite sweater still hung over the chair by her desk. The book she'd been reading during her last visit lay open on the nightstand, a bookmark shaped like a butterfly marking her place on page 217. Every morning I'd stand in her doorway and expect to see her there, curled up under her grandmother's quilt, dark hair spread across the pillow like it had been when she was 12, and I'd wake her for school. The rational part of my mind knew she was gone, but my heart kept forgetting. Lucky had taken to sleeping in her room, curled up on the rug beside her bed. Sometimes I'd hear him whimpering in his sleep, and I wondered if he was dreaming about her too. Dogs understand death differently than humans do, but they understand absence just fine. He knew Amanda wasn't coming back, even if he couldn't understand why. The neighbors started bringing casseroles around the second week. Mrs. Henderson from next door appeared at my door with a tuna noodle casserole and red-rimmed eyes. "I'm so sorry about Amanda, William," she said, pressing the warm dish into my hands. She was such a bright light, always had a smile and a wave when she'd come visit. I thanked her and added the casserole to the growing collection in my refrigerator. People meant well, but food was the last thing on my mind. I'd lost 15 pounds without trying, and my clothes hung loose on my frame. It was Mrs. Henderson who first planted the seed of doubt, though she didn't mean to. I have to say, she mentioned during one of her check-in visits, Mason seemed awfully composed at the funeral home when he came to pick up Amanda's effects. My Herald was a wreck for months after his brother died, but Mason was talking business with the funeral director, like he was buying a car. She realized what she'd said and immediately backtracked. Of course, people grieve differently. Some folks shut down emotionally to cope. I didn't mean anything by it. But the comment stuck with me. I hadn't been there to see Mason at the funeral home, hadn't been there for any of it. I'd trusted him to handle everything because I was too broken to function, but now I wondered what I'd missed. The second comment came from Tom Bradley, who owned the hardware store downtown. I'd gone in to buy new locks for the house, a security impulse that didn't make much logical sense, but felt necessary somehow. "Sorry for your loss, William," Tom said as he rang up the deadbolts. "Amanda was a sweet girl, always polite, always asking about my grandkids when she'd come in here with you." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "I saw her husband at the bank last week," Tom continued. "Day before you told me about the accident, actually. Seemed to be in good spirits. Had a stack of paperwork with him, looked like insurance forms or something official. My hand stilled on the counter. You sure it was the day before? Positive. It was Thursday because I remember thinking how nice it was to see a young couple taking care of their financial business. Responsible, you know? Then when you told me about the drowning on Friday, Tom shook his head. Guess you never know what life's going to throw at you. I carried those locks home, but I couldn't stop thinking about Tom's words. If Mason had been at the bank on Thursday with insurance paperwork, and Amanda had died on Wednesday according to his story, how had he managed to get insurance forms processed so quickly? International death certificates, especially for accidental drownings, usually took weeks to process. That night I called the resort where they'd been staying. After being transferred 3 times, I finally reached someone in guest services who could access their records. Mr. Parker, I show a Mason and Amanda Thompson checked in on Sunday, May 15th, the woman said in a practiced, sympathetic voice. I'm very sorry for your family's loss. The management here was deeply saddened by the incident. Can you tell me exactly when the accident occurred? I asked, gripping the phone tighter than necessary. According to our incident report, Mrs. Thompson was reported missing on Wednesday evening, May 18th. The Coast Guard search began immediately. Her body was recovered Friday morning. The timeline matched what Mason had told me, but something about the woman's tone bothered me. She sounded like she was reading from a script. Was there anything unusual about the incident? I pressed. Anything that stood out to your staff? There was a long pause. Sir, I'm not really authorized to discuss details of ongoing investigations. Ongoing investigations. I'm sorry. I misspoke. What I meant was the local authorities handled all the official aspects of the case. You'd need to contact them directly for any specific information. She gave me a phone number for the Nassau Police Department, but when I called the next day, I was told that they had no record of any investigation into Amanda Thompson's death. Accidental drowning, case closed, body released to next of kin for burial. The contradictions were small, probably meaningless, but they gnawed at me. I started making lists, writing down every detail I could remember from Mason's story, every comment from neighbors and friends, every timeline discrepancy that didn't quite fit. Amanda's friend Jessica called in the 3rd week to check on me. She'd been Amanda's maid of honor and had known her since college. I keep expecting her to call, Jessica said, her voice thick with tears. We talked every Sunday morning for 6 years. This past Sunday, I actually picked up the phone to dial her number before I remembered. I do the same thing, I admitted. Sometimes I catch myself buying 2 steaks at the grocery store because I forget she won't be coming for dinner Sunday night. We sat in comfortable shared grief for a moment before Jessica spoke again. William, can I ask you something? Did Amanda seem happy to you in the weeks before the wedding? Really happy, I mean, not just bride-excited happy? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? She called me the night before they left for their honeymoon. It was late, maybe 11 o'clock. She said she couldn't sleep, that she was having second thoughts about the marriage. My stomach dropped. Second thoughts. She didn't give me details, just said that Mason had been acting differently since the wedding. More possessive, more controlling. She said he'd gotten angry when she'd wanted to keep her maiden name professionally, and he'd insisted on being added to her bank accounts immediately after the ceremony. I set down my coffee cup with a trembling hand. Amanda had never mentioned any of this to me. She said she felt like she'd married a stranger, Jessica continued. Like Mason had been playing a role during their entire courtship, and now that they were married, the real Mason was coming out. She was scared, William. Really scared. Why didn't she tell me? You know Amanda. She hated admitting when she'd made a mistake, especially a big one. She said she was going to use the honeymoon to figure things out, maybe talk to Mason about couples counseling when they got back. Jessica's words hit me like cold water. My daughter had been afraid of her husband, and she died before she could escape him. The timing felt too convenient, too neat. Jessica, I said carefully, did Amanda know how to swim? Are you kidding? She was practically a fish. Remember, she was on the swim team in high school. She could do laps for hours. Why would you? Jessica's voice trailed off as she realized what I was implying. Oh my God, William, you don't think... I didn't answer, because I didn't know what I thought. All I knew was that my champion swimmer daughter had supposedly drowned in calm Caribbean waters, and her husband had seemed awfully eager to collect insurance money and get out of town. That night, I called Mason's phone number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again the next day and the day after that. The number had been disconnected. Mason had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed, taking with him any chance I had of getting real answers about what had happened to my daughter. But he'd left behind enough inconsistencies and unanswered questions to keep me awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if Amanda's death had been as accidental as everyone believed. Lucky seemed to sense my growing agitation. He followed me more closely, pressed against my legs when I sat down, watched me with worried brown eyes that reminded me painfully of Amanda's. Sometimes I caught him staring at the front door, as if he expected her to walk through it at any moment. We were both waiting for someone who would never come home. The difference was, Lucky still had hope. I was beginning to have something much more dangerous than hope. I was beginning to have suspicions. 6 years had passed since that awful Tuesday morning when Mason brought me Lucky, and the news that shattered my world. 6 years of quiet grief, of learning to live with the constant ache of Amanda's absence. I'd settled into a routine that revolved around work, Lucky's daily walks, and the small rituals that kept Amanda's memory alive. Her room remained untouched, a shrine to a life cut too short. I'd stopped expecting answers about the inconsistencies in Mason's story. The Nassau police had closed the case, the insurance company had paid out, and Mason had disappeared completely. I'd hired a private investigator 2 years after Amanda's death, but he'd found nothing except dead ends and disconnected phone numbers. Mason Thompson seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth. Then, on a grey October morning that felt like an echo of that terrible day 6 years earlier, a process server knocked on my door. William Parker? The young man held a thick manila envelope with the kind of official seals that never bring good news. I signed for the papers with hands that had aged more than 6 years should allow. Lucky, now greying around his muzzle, stayed close to my legs as I read the documents that would upend my carefully constructed peace. Mason was suing me. After 6 years of silence, he was taking me to court for theft of his deceased wife's belongings. According to the lawsuit, I had unlawfully retained valuable jewelry, family heirlooms, and personal effects that belonged to him as Amanda's surviving spouse. He was demanding their immediate return, plus damages for what his lawyer called intentional infliction of emotional distress through withholding of sentimental items. The papers fell from my hands like autumn leaves. Lucky sniffed at them nervously, sensing my distress. 6 years of believing Mason was gone forever, and now he was back, reaching through the legal system to tear apart the last pieces of Amanda's life that I had left. The jewelry he mentioned included her grandmother's engagement ring, the one Amanda had worn on her right hand since she was 16. The family heirlooms were things that had belonged to my family for generations, a music box that had been my mother's, a pearl necklace that had been my wife's. These weren't Amanda's belongings that happened to be in my house. These were pieces of our family history that she'd inherited from her mother's side, items that Mason had no legitimate claim to, but according to the legal papers, he was now married to someone named Sarah Collins Thompson, and apparently his new wife wanted my dead daughter's jewelry. The address on the lawsuit showed Mason living just 2 hours away in Richmond. All this time, while I'd been grieving and wondering what had really happened to Amanda, he'd been building a new life practically in my backyard. I called Robert Chen, the lawyer who'd handled my wife's estate years earlier. Robert was in his 70s now, but his mind was still sharp and he'd known Amanda since she was a child. "This is interesting timing," Robert said after reviewing the papers. "Why wait 6 years to claim these items? And some of these pieces he's demanding never belonged to Amanda in the first place. What do you mean? Your wife's pearl necklace, for instance, that was specifically left to you in her will, with instructions that it should eventually go to any future daughters-in-law or granddaughters. Amanda wore it occasionally, but she never owned it. And this music box was your mother's, not Amanda's. Mason would have no legal claim to items that weren't part of the marital estate." Robert leaned back in his chair, studying the papers more carefully. "William, I think there's something else going on here. This lawsuit isn't really about the jewelry. What do you think it's about? I think someone's been doing research on your assets. The items listed here aren't just random belongings. They're specifically the most valuable pieces Amanda had access to. Someone's been very thorough in cataloging what they think they can get." The realization hit me like ice water. "You think his new wife put him up to this?" "I think Mason Thompson has found himself a woman who's very interested in Amanda's inheritance, and I think she's convinced him that he's entitled to a lot more than what Amanda actually owned." Over the next few weeks, as Robert prepared our defense, more details about Mason's new life came to light. Sarah Collins Thompson wasn't just any woman. She was a paralegal who specialized in estate law. She'd met Mason 18 months after Amanda's death, when he'd consulted her firm about inheritance issues. Their courthouse wedding had taken place exactly 2 years after Amanda's funeral, just long enough to avoid looking completely heartless. Sarah had a history of relationships with widowed men. She'd been engaged twice before to men who'd lost their wives, both engagements ending when the men's families raised questions about her motives. Mason was husband number 3, and based on the timing of this lawsuit, Sarah had apparently spent considerable time researching exactly what she thought she could claim from Amanda's estate. The interesting thing, Robert told me during one of our preparation meetings, is that Mason collected a substantial life insurance payout when Amanda died. $250,000. If he was really struggling financially, why didn't he pursue these items years ago? Maybe because he knew he didn't have a legitimate claim, or maybe because someone recently convinced him that he did. The depositions began in November. Mason looked older, softer around the edges, wearing an expensive suit that suggested his finances were doing just fine. He avoided eye contact with me completely, focusing on his lawyer's questions with the kind of rehearsed precision that made it clear he'd been coached extensively. "Mr. Thompson," Robert began during cross-examination, "you stated that you gave Mr. Parker these items immediately after your wife's death because you were too grief-stricken to deal with them. Is that correct?" "Yes. But you also testified that you collected Mrs. Thompson's life insurance benefits within 6 weeks of her death. How were you emotionally capable of handling complex insurance paperwork but not capable of securing valuable jewelry?" Mason's lawyer objected, but the question had hit its mark. Mason's carefully constructed narrative was starting to show cracks. "Mr. Thompson, when did you first decide that you wanted these items back?" "I've always wanted them back. They're all I have left of Amanda." "But you made no attempt to contact Mr. Parker for 6 years. No phone calls, no letters, no requests through mutual friends. Why the sudden urgency now?" "I needed time to heal. Sarah helped me realize that I was entitled to have Amanda's things." "Sarah being your current wife?" "Yes." "The paralegal who specializes in estate disputes?" Mason's face flushed red. "Sarah's professional expertise has nothing to do with this, doesn't it? Isn't it true that your wife Sarah researched Mr. Parker's assets and identified the most valuable items that Amanda had access to, regardless of whether Amanda actually owned them?" "That's not true." Robert pulled out a stack of documents. "Mr. Thompson, are you aware that your wife requested copies of Amanda's death certificate, your marriage certificate, and Mr. Parker's property records from the county clerk's office? All of this research was done before you filed this lawsuit." The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of pages turning as Robert laid out evidence of Sarah's systematic investigation into what she thought she could claim. She'd even visited the jewelry store where Amanda's engagement ring had been purchased, asking detailed questions about its value and whether there were any other pieces purchased at the same time. "Your Honor," Mason's lawyer interjected, "my client's wife's professional diligence in researching this matter doesn't invalidate his legitimate claims to his deceased wife's belongings." "No," Robert agreed, "but it does establish motive and timing. Mr. Thompson showed no interest in these items until he married someone who made it her business to know their value. During a recess, I saw Mason in the hallway, speaking in hushed, urgent tones with a woman I assumed was Sarah. She was blonde, expensively dressed, with the kind of sharp features that suggested she was used to getting what she wanted. When she noticed me watching, she whispered something to Mason that made him look in my direction with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't grief or sadness. It was something closer to guilt, mixed with a fear that made my skin crawl. For 6 years, I'd wondered what had really happened to Amanda in those Caribbean waters. Looking at Mason's face in that courthouse hallway, I realized I might finally be about to find out. "Robert," I said when we reconvened, "I want to know everything about that insurance payout. How was it processed so quickly? What documentation did Mason provide?" "Why?" "Because I don't think Amanda's death was an accident, and I think Mason knows it." The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for 6 years. Robert studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Let me make some calls," he said. "If you're right, this lawsuit might be the biggest mistake Mason Thompson ever made." As we prepared to resume testimony, I caught sight of Mason again. This time, he was looking directly at me, and what I saw in his eyes confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. Mason wasn't just here for jewelry. He was here because he was afraid of something, and that something was the truth about what had really happened to my daughter. After 6 years of questions without answers, I was finally going to get the truth. The only question was whether I was strong enough to handle it. Robert worked through the night, and by morning he'd uncovered information that changed everything. The insurance company that had paid Mason's claim so quickly had their own suspicions about Amanda's death. They'd conducted a quiet investigation, but without concrete evidence of foul play, they'd been legally obligated to pay the claim. However, they'd kept their investigation file open, hoping someday they'd have grounds to reopen the case. "William," Robert said, spreading documents across his desk like evidence at a crime scene, "Mason lied about almost everything. The timeline, the circumstances, even the location where Amanda's body was found." My hands shook as I reached for the insurance investigator's report. "What do you mean?" "According to the resort's actual records, Mason and Amanda had a violent argument in their hotel room the night before she disappeared. Hotel security was called twice. The first time was for noise complaints from other guests. The second time was because a maid reported hearing what sounded like someone being hit. The words felt like physical blows." "Someone hit Amanda?" "The security guard's report states that when they knocked on the door, Mason answered and claimed everything was fine. He was sweating heavily and appeared agitated. Amanda was visible in the background, but she didn't speak. The guard noted that she had what appeared to be a red mark on her left cheek." I closed my eyes, trying to process the image of my daughter being hurt by the man she'd trusted enough to marry. Why didn't they do anything? International jurisdiction, no direct complaint from the victim, and Mason's insistence that it was just a verbal disagreement. The guard filed a report, but no action was taken. Robert turned to another page. Here's where the story gets more interesting. Mason claimed Amanda drowned while swimming to the reef at Paradise Cove, but Paradise Cove is a protected marine sanctuary. Swimming there is prohibited, and it's clearly marked with warning signs. No tourist would accidentally end up in that water. So where did she really drown? According to the Coast Guard report, Amanda's body was found at Devil's Point, which is a notorious dangerous area with strong currents and undertows. It's 3 miles from Paradise Cove. The question is, how did she get from a prohibited swimming area to a completely different location? Robert pulled out a map of the island, marking the locations with red pins. The currents in that area don't flow from Paradise Cove to Devil's Point. They flow in the opposite direction. For Amanda's body to end up where it was found, she would have had to enter the water much closer to Devil's Point itself. The implications made my stomach turn. "You're saying Mason lied about where she went swimming?" "I'm saying Mason's version of events is physically impossible. And there's more." Robert opened another file. The insurance investigator interviewed the hotel staff. The day Amanda disappeared, Mason checked out of their room at 11:30 in the morning. He told the front desk that his wife was at the spa and would meet him later, but the spa has no record of Amanda having any appointments that day. Where was she? Nobody knows. The last confirmed sighting of Amanda alive was at 7 a.m. when room service delivered breakfast to their room. After that, she vanishes from the record until her body turns up 3 days later. I stared at the timeline Robert had constructed, trying to make sense of the gaps. What was Mason doing during those missing hours? That's the interesting part. Mason rented a boat that morning, a small fishing vessel from a private marina about 5 miles from the hotel. He returned it that evening, claiming he'd had engine trouble and had to spend most of the day anchored in a cove. The picture Robert was painting made my blood run cold. "You think he took Amanda out on that boat?" "I think Mason Thompson killed your daughter, William. I think they had a fight that got out of hand, and he panicked. He took her body out on that boat and dumped it near Devil's Point, then spent the day creating an alibi." The room spun around me. For 6 years, I'd suspected something wasn't right about Amanda's death, but hearing it stated so bluntly was like being hit by lightning. "Can we prove any of this?" "Not yet, but Mason made a critical error by filing this lawsuit. He's opened himself up to discovery, which means we can subpoena records that the insurance company couldn't access before. Bank statements, phone records, credit card transactions from that trip." Robert leaned forward, his expression grim but determined. "More importantly, he's put himself in a courtroom where he has to testify under oath. If he's been lying for 6 years, We're going to expose those lies. The next day's testimony began with Mason's detailed account of Amanda's final morning. Under direct examination from his own lawyer, he repeated the same story he'd told me 6 years earlier. Amanda had wanted to swim to the reef. The current was stronger than expected. He'd tried to save her but couldn't reach her in time. When Robert began his cross-examination, the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Mr. Thompson, you testified that your wife wanted to swim to the reef at Paradise Cove. Are you aware that swimming is prohibited in that area?" No, I don't remember seeing any signs." Robert approached the witness stand with a photograph. "This is a picture of the Paradise Cove beach entrance, taken by the insurance investigator 2 weeks after your wife's death. Can you see the signs in this photograph?" Mason squinted at the image. The signs were clearly visible, multiple warnings in both English and Spanish about the protected marine sanctuary and the prohibition on swimming. "I guess I missed them. We were on our honeymoon. I wasn't paying attention to signs." "You weren't paying attention to signs that were directly in your path to the beach, signs that are 6 feet tall and printed in bright red letters." "I was distracted." "By what?" Mason's lawyer objected, but Robert was just getting started. "Mr. Thompson, you also testified that you checked out of your hotel room before going to Paradise Cove. Why did you check out if you were planning to return to the hotel that evening?" "Amanda wanted to check out early. She thought we might want to stay somewhere else for our last night." "But you had non-refundable reservations at one of the most exclusive resorts on the island. Why would your wife want to give up a luxury suite to find last-minute accommodations?" Mason shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "She was impulsive like that. Was she also impulsive enough to want to take a boat ride on your final day, even though neither of you had any boating experience?" The courtroom went silent. Mason's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." Robert produced another document. "This is a rental agreement from Nassau Marine Services, dated the day your wife disappeared. You rented a 20-foot fishing boat for 8 hours. Your signature is at the bottom." That wasn't for a boat ride. I wanted to go fishing." "You wanted to go fishing on the same day your wife supposedly drowned while swimming." "It was, I changed my plans when she decided to swim." "Mr. Thompson, according to this rental agreement, you kept the boat for the entire day. You didn't return it until 6 p.m. If you changed your plans to help your wife swim, why didn't you return the boat earlier?" Mason looked desperately toward his lawyer, who was frantically shuffling through papers. "I had engine trouble. I was stuck." "Engine trouble that prevented you from calling for help when your wife was drowning 3 miles away?" "I didn't know she was drowning. I thought she was at the spa." "But you just testified that you were with her at Paradise Cove when she decided to swim." Mason realized his mistake too late. He'd contradicted his own story, and the jury had heard every word. "Mr. Thompson, where exactly was your wife when you last saw her alive?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Mason opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. No sound came out. "Your Honor," Robert said quietly, "I believe the witness needs a moment to collect his thoughts." This seems to be difficult for him. But Mason wasn't collecting his thoughts. He was falling apart. 6 years of lies were crumbling around him, and everyone in that courtroom could see it happening. "I want to change my testimony," Mason said suddenly. "I want to tell the truth." His lawyer jumped up. "Your Honor, I need a recess to consult with my client." "Denied," the judge said. "Mr. Thompson, you're under oath. If you have corrections to make to your testimony, make them now." Mason looked around the courtroom like a trapped animal. His eyes found mine, and for the first time in 6 years I saw something that might have been remorse. "Amanda didn't drown swimming to a reef," he said, his voice barely audible. "She never went swimming at all." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. The judge banged his gavel for order, but I barely heard it. After 6 years of questions, I was finally going to learn what really happened to my daughter. "Mr. Thompson," Robert said carefully, "are you saying that your previous testimony was false?" "Yes." "Are you prepared to tell this court what really happened to Amanda Parker Thompson?" Mason looked at me again, and this time I saw tears in his eyes. "She found out about the insurance policy. She was going to leave me. We fought and she fell and hit her head. I panicked. I thought everyone would blame me, so I—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The truth was finally out, and it was every bit as horrible as I'd feared. My daughter hadn't drowned in an accident. She died because the man who promised to love and protect her had chosen to cover up his crime instead of calling for help. But as devastating as Mason's confession was, I had the strangest feeling that there was still more to this story. Something about the way he'd looked at me, something about the fear in his eyes suggested that even now, he wasn't telling the complete truth. The judge called a recess, and as the courtroom emptied, I sat in my chair and wondered if I was finally hearing the whole truth, or if this was just another layer of lies from a man who'd been deceiving everyone for 6 years. The recess felt endless. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, trying to process Mason's partial confession. He'd admitted that Amanda's death wasn't an accident, that they'd fought, that she'd fallen and hit her head, but something about his story still didn't add up. The timeline was wrong, the details felt rehearsed, and that look of fear in his eyes suggested he was still hiding something crucial. Robert found me staring at the floor, my hands clasped so tightly my knuckles had gone white. "William, I know this is overwhelming, but Mason's confession changes everything. We can get the district attorney involved now. There could be criminal charges." I looked up at him. "Robert, I don't think he's telling the truth. Not the whole truth." "What do you mean?" "That story about Amanda falling and hitting her head. It's too convenient, too clean. Mason's had 6 years to come up with a version of events that makes him look like a man who panicked rather than a man who committed murder." Robert sat down beside me on the hard wooden bench. "You think there's more?" "I think Mason Thompson is still lying about what happened to my daughter, and I think someone else knows the truth." As if summoned by my words, the courtroom door opened and the bailiff stepped out. "Court's resuming in 5 minutes." We filed back into the courtroom where Mason sat at the defendant's table, looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in 30 minutes. His lawyer was whispering urgently in his ear, probably trying to minimize the damage from his client's unexpected confession. Judge Harrison called the court to order and looked directly at Mason. "Mr. Thompson, before we continue, I want to be clear about what you've just admitted under oath. You've testified that your wife Amanda Thompson did not die in a swimming accident as you previously claimed. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "And you've testified that she died as a result of injuries sustained during an argument between the two of you?" Mason hesitated. "Yes." "Mr. Thompson, given the serious nature of these admissions, I'm going to advise you of your right to remain silent and your right to legal counsel in any potential criminal proceedings. Do you understand these rights?" "I understand." "Do you wish to continue your testimony?" Mason looked around the courtroom wildly, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. His eyes stopped on the door at the back of the courtroom, and his face went completely white. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking, I need to change my testimony again." The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Thompson, you've already admitted to giving false testimony. Are you now saying that your most recent statements were also false?" Mason started, then stopped. He was looking at something behind me, something that had clearly terrified him. I turned around to see what had captured his attention, and my heart stopped. A woman was standing in the doorway of the courtroom. She had dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, was wearing a blue dress I recognized, and was carrying a small white purse that had been a birthday gift from me 3 years earlier. The woman was Amanda. The silence in the courtroom stretched for exactly 17 seconds. I counted them, because focusing on the numbers was the only thing keeping me from collapsing. 17 seconds of absolute stillness, while my brain tried to process what my eyes were seeing. Amanda, my daughter, alive, standing in the doorway of a courtroom where her husband was confessing to killing her. She looked older, thinner than I remembered. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 6 years ago, and her hair was shorter, but it was unmistakably Amanda, unmistakably my daughter, unmistakably alive. "Oh my God," someone whispered behind me. I think it might have been me. Mason had gone from white to green. He gripped the edge of the witness stand so hard, I could see his knuckles straining against his skin. "Amanda," he said, his voice barely audible, "but how are you?" Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order to a courtroom that had erupted in chaos. Lawyers were on their feet, court reporters were looking around in confusion, and the jury was staring at the woman in the doorway like she was a ghost. Amanda walked slowly down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. She kept her eyes fixed on Mason, and the expression on her face was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was something colder, more final. "Your Honor," she said when she reached the front of the courtroom, "my name is Amanda Parker. I believe my husband has been telling people I'm dead. The judge stared at her for a long moment, then looked at Mason, then back at Amanda. Mrs. Parker, Amanda said firmly. I kept my maiden name, and I'd like to testify in this case if I may. Mason's lawyer was frantically shuffling through papers, probably looking for some legal precedent for what to do when the alleged murder victim shows up alive in the middle of her husband's confession. Your Honor, Robert said, standing up with the kind of composure that comes from 40 years of courtroom experience, I'd like to call Amanda Parker as a witness for the plaintiff. Judge Harrison looked around the courtroom as if hoping someone could explain what was happening. This is highly irregular. Miss Parker, you're claiming to be Amanda Thompson, the woman whose death is the subject of these proceedings. I'm claiming to be Amanda Parker, the woman whose murder my husband has apparently been confessing to, although I notice he's changed his story several times now. Amanda's voice was steady, controlled, but I could hear an undercurrent of something that made my chest tighten. Fear. Despite her calm exterior, she was afraid. Mason, she said, turning to face him directly, why don't you tell the court what really happened 6 years ago? The truth this time. Mason opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a man watching his worst nightmare come to life. Your Honor, Amanda continued, 6 years ago my husband tried to kill me for the insurance money. When he thought he'd succeeded, he dumped what he believed was my body in the ocean and came back here to collect $250,000. He's been living off that money ever since, and now he's married to a woman who's helping him try to steal what's left of my family's belongings. The courtroom erupted again. This time Judge Harrison didn't bother with his gavel. He stood up and pointed at Amanda. Madam, these are extremely serious accusations. If what you're saying is true, we're looking at attempted murder, insurance fraud, and perjury charges that could send Mr. Thompson to prison for the rest of his life. I know exactly what we're looking at, Your Honor. I've had 6 years to think about it. Where have you been for 6 years? The judge asked. Amanda's composure finally cracked slightly. Hiding, running, trying to stay alive long enough to see justice done. She looked directly at me for the first time since entering the courtroom. Hi, Dad. I'm sorry I couldn't come home sooner. I tried to stand up, tried to speak, tried to do something, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My daughter was alive. After 6 years of grief, 6 years of believing she was gone forever, she was standing 15 feet away from me. Amanda, I managed to whisper. I know this is a shock, she said, and I could see tears gathering in her eyes. I wanted to come home so many times. I wanted to call you, write to you, let you know I was okay, but I couldn't risk it. Mason told me he'd kill you too if I ever tried to contact you. Mason finally found his voice. You're supposed to be dead. I saw you go under. I watched you drown. You watched me go under, Amanda agreed. But you didn't wait around to make sure I was actually dead. Lucky for me, you were always impatient. She turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to tell you exactly what happened on that boat 6 years ago. I'd like to explain why I've been living under an assumed name in Colorado, working as a waitress and sleeping with a gun under my pillow, and I'd like to see my husband face justice for what he did to me and to my father. Judge Harrison sat back down slowly. Miss Parker, I think we all need to hear your story, but first, I'm going to call a recess to sort out the legal implications of this situation. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Thompson to a holding cell, and someone call the district attorney's office. We're going to need prosecutors here. As the bailiff approached Mason, he looked at Amanda with an expression of pure hatred. You destroyed my life, he said. Amanda's response was quiet, but clear enough for everyone in the courtroom to hear. You destroyed mine first. The difference is, I survived. As Mason was led away in handcuffs, Amanda finally looked at me again. This time she smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the little girl who used to run to me with scraped knees and broken toys, trusting that I could fix anything. Dad, she said, can we go home? I've missed you so much. 6 years of grief, 6 years of questions, 6 years of missing her more than I thought it was possible to miss another human being. And now she was here, alive, asking if we could go home. I stood up on shaking legs and walked toward my daughter, the daughter I'd thought I'd lost forever. When I reached her, she stepped into my arms, and for the first time in 6 years, my world felt complete again. Welcome home, sweetheart, I whispered into her hair. Welcome home. The drive home from the courthouse felt like traveling through a dream. Amanda sat in the passenger seat of my truck, the same seat she'd occupied thousands of times growing up, but everything felt simultaneously familiar and impossible. Every few seconds, I'd glance over to confirm she was really there, really alive, really coming home with me after 6 years of believing she was gone forever. "Dad, you can stop checking," she said with a small smile that reminded me painfully of her mother. "I'm not going to disappear. I'm sorry. I just can't believe you're here. All this time I thought..." "I know what you thought. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't find a way to let you know I was alive." Lucky was waiting in the front yard when we pulled into the driveway, his tail wagging tentatively, as if he sensed something momentous was happening but couldn't quite believe it. When Amanda stepped out of the truck, he froze for a moment, then launched himself at her with the kind of joy that only dogs can express. "Lucky boy," Amanda laughed, kneeling down to accept his enthusiastic kisses. "You got so grey, but you're still my good boy, aren't you?" Watching my daughter reunite with her dog, seeing Lucky's pure happiness at having her back, I finally started to believe this was real. Amanda was home. Inside the house, she stopped in the front hallway and looked around with an expression I couldn't read. "You kept everything exactly the same," she said softly. "I couldn't change anything. It felt like giving up on you." She walked into the living room, touching familiar objects like she was reacquainting herself with a life she'd had to leave behind. When she reached the mantelpiece, she stopped at the photo from her college graduation, the last picture we'd taken together before she'd met Mason. "I used to dream about this room," she said. "When things got really bad, when I was scared and alone, I'd close my eyes and imagine sitting on this couch with you and Lucky, watching old movies and eating too much popcorn." I joined her by the fireplace. "Amanda, what happened that day? What really happened?" She was quiet for a long time, staring at the graduation photo. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but distant, like she was recounting someone else's story. "Mason had been getting more controlling since the wedding. He wanted access to all my accounts, wanted me to quit my job, wanted me to cut contact with my friends. The night before I disappeared, I told him I wanted an annulment. I said I'd made a mistake marrying him." She moved to the couch and sat down, Lucky immediately jumping up to curl beside her. "He went crazy, Dad. He said he'd invested too much in our marriage to let me just walk away. He'd taken out that life insurance policy on me without telling me, and he'd already borrowed against it. If I left him, he'd lose everything." My hands clenched into fists. "He planned to kill you for money. He said it would look like an accident, a tragic honeymoon drowning. He'd be the grieving widower, and no one would question the insurance payout." Amanda's voice remained calm, but I could see her hands trembling slightly. "The next morning, he told me we were going for a romantic boat ride to celebrate our last day in paradise. I didn't want to go, but he insisted. He seemed different, calmer, and I thought maybe he'd accepted that our marriage was over." She paused, scratching Lucky behind the ears. "We got about 2 miles offshore, and he started talking about the insurance money. He said he was sorry, but he needed me to understand that he had no choice. Then he hit me with an oar. The words hit me like physical blows. My daughter, attacked by the man who'd promised to love and protect her. I went over the side of the boat. The water was so cold and my head was bleeding. Mason just sat there watching me struggle. He wanted to make sure I drowned before he called for help." "How did you survive?" "There was a fishing boat about a 1/4 mile away. The captain saw me go in the water and came over to investigate. By the time he reached me, Mason had already started heading back to shore. The fisherman, his name was Carlos, pulled me out of the water unconscious." Amanda looked at me directly for the first time since beginning her story. "When I woke up in Carlos's boat, I told him what had happened. He said if I went to the police, it would be my word against Mason's, and Mason would just try again. Carlos had a sister who worked with an organization that helped women disappear from abusive situations. He said they could help me start over somewhere safe. So you let everyone believe you were dead. It was the only way to stay alive, Dad. Mason thought he'd killed me. As long as he believed that, I was safe, but if he found out I'd survived..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Mason had already shown he was willing to commit murder once. If he'd discovered Amanda was alive, he would have tried again. "The hardest part was knowing what it would do to you," Amanda continued, tears finally starting to fall. "I knew you'd grieve for me. I knew you'd blame yourself somehow. But I also knew that if I tried to contact you, Mason would eventually figure out where I was. Where have you been all this time?" "Colorado, mostly. Working in restaurants, using the name Sarah Collins. Ironic, isn't it? Mason ended up marrying someone who shares my fake identity. I moved around a lot the first few years, never staying anywhere long enough to form real friendships, always looking over my shoulder. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. 2 years ago, I hired a private investigator to keep track of Mason. I wanted to know if he'd moved on, if he was still a threat. That's when I found out about his new wife and her background in estate law. You knew about the lawsuit? I knew Sarah was pushing Mason to go after anything valuable that had belonged to me. I also knew that if they took you to court, Mason would have to testify under oath about my death. I was hoping he'd slip up and contradict his own story. So you planned this? You planned to show up in court today? Amanda nodded. I've been in Richmond for 3 months, staying in a motel and watching the proceedings. I was waiting for the right moment to reveal myself. When Mason started changing his testimony, I knew it was time. The courage it must have taken, spending 6 years in hiding, then deliberately walking into a courtroom to face the man who'd tried to kill her, left me speechless. What happens now? I asked. Now Mason goes to prison for attempted murder, insurance fraud and perjury. His wife Sarah will probably face charges for conspiracy and fraud, and I get to reclaim my life. She looked around the room again, taking in all the familiar details she'd been forced to leave behind. Dad, I know I can't just pick up where I left off. 6 years is a long time. I'm not the same person I was when I left, and I'm sure you've changed too. But I'd like to try to rebuild our relationship if you'll let me. I moved to sit beside her on the couch, Lucky settling contentedly between us like he used to do when Amanda was in high school. Sweetheart, you're my daughter. Nothing that's happened changes that. Nothing Mason did or didn't do changes that. You're home now, and that's all that matters to me. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us adjusting to the reality of being together again. Outside, the afternoon sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard where Amanda used to play as a child. There's something else, Amanda said eventually. The insurance company wants their money back from Mason, obviously, but they're also paying a reward for information leading to the recovery of fraudulent claims. It's enough money for me to start over properly. Maybe go back to school, maybe start the interior design business I always talked about. You don't need reward money to start over. This is your home. Whatever you need, we'll figure it out together. She leaned against my shoulder the way she used to when she was little and had a bad dream. I missed you so much, Dad. There were so many times I wanted to call you, especially on your birthday and on the anniversary of Mom's death. I hated that you were going through all those milestones alone. I wasn't completely alone. I had Lucky. He missed you too, you know. For the first year after you died, he used to wait by the front door every evening around the time you used to come visit. Amanda looked down at the dog, who was now snoring softly between us. He's getting old. We're all getting older. But we're together now, that's what matters. 3 months later, Mason Thompson was sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted murder, insurance fraud, and perjury. Sarah Thompson received 3 years for conspiracy and fraud. The insurance company recovered their fraudulent payout and, as promised, gave Amanda a substantial reward for her role in exposing the crime. Amanda used the money to enroll in business school and to start her interior design practice. She moved back into her old room temporarily while she looked for a place of her own, but there was no rush. After 6 years of separation, we were both content to spend quiet evenings catching up on lost time. The nightmares took longer to fade. Some nights I'd wake up in a panic, convinced that finding Amanda alive had been just another cruel dream. I'd get up and check her room, needing to see her sleeping peacefully before I could rest again. Amanda had her own struggles with trust and fear. She installed multiple locks on her bedroom door and kept a phone by her bed programmed with 911 on speed dial. But slowly, gradually, she began to relax into the safety of being home. 6 months after the trial, we were having Sunday dinner when Amanda looked up from her plate and said, "Dad, I think I'm ready to visit Mom's grave. Will you come with me?" We drove to the cemetery that afternoon, Lucky riding in the back seat like old times. At her mother's headstone, Amanda knelt and placed a bouquet of daisies, her mother's favorite flower. "Hi, Mom," she said softly. "I'm sorry I've been away so long. I had some things I needed to work out. But I'm home now and I'm safe, and Dad and I are taking care of each other just like you always wanted." The wind rustled through the trees overhead, and for a moment, I could almost imagine it was her mother's way of saying she approved. As we walked back to the truck, Amanda slipped her arm through mine. "Thank you for never giving up on me, Dad, even when you thought I was gone." "I'm your father," I said. "Giving up was never an option." Lucky barked from the truck, impatient to get home for his dinner. Amanda laughed, the sound bright and free in the afternoon air. "Come on," she said. "Let's go home." Home. After 6 years of grief and questions and missing her more than I thought possible, my daughter was finally truly home, and this time nothing was going to take her away from me again.